Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Ali-Murati, and I'm the marketing manager for Cablecast Community Media. And thank you all for joining us today for our PEG Experts Forum webinar series. The PEG Experts Forum is actually something that was started a few years ago at Tightrope, actually by one of our hosts of today's webinar, Daniell, Krawczyk, as a way to bring deeper conversations about solutions beyond what Cablecast offers or what Tightrope Media Systems offers, particularly stuff that gets talked about at trade shows and networking events and things like that, because sometimes people can't make it to those events, and it's nice to take a deeper dive remotely where we can bring a bunch of people from all over the country together. So since then, the PEG Experts Forum has actually expanded, and now we have a webinar series, we have live workshops that we've done, and also this new PEG Experts blog, which I'll show you. For those of you who haven't seen our Cablecast website, you just go to cablecast.tv, and under our community resources, we have the PEG Experts blog. And that's where you're going to find a lot of industry content that we've put together from various contributors in both the PEG world and also the nonprofit world. So you'll see here, we just recently put up Daniell's first post about closed captioning, and we're expanding on the conversation here in this webinar. So if you want to go back for some references and just quick summary of what we talked about today, this will be a great resource. And there's some other things there as well. So today we'll be talking about closed captioning with Daniell Krawczyk of Municipal Captioning and Vince Rotty of Bradley Law, Minnesota. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Daniell.
Hey everybody, my name is Daniell Krawczyk. As Michelle mentioned, I had a role in the creation of this PEG Experts Forum, so I'm especially proud to be able to participate in one. And I'm really excited also to have Vince Rotty joining me today. One of the things I always end up saying when I'm giving these kinds of presentations is I am not a lawyer. So we're all exceptionally lucky to have a lawyer who can speak more officially on the legal side of things. The goal, I just like to always start out now with the goal. The goal is to be kind, both to yourself by addressing these things before it becomes something you're forced to deal with on a shorter timeline than you need to usually take on things like this. And then also be kind to your community, because it's something that benefits the deaf in your community, the hard of hearing, those learning to read, those with processing disorders that make it a lot easier to read text than hear it and process it. And also those learning English. So it's really a big benefit to a wide range of folks. And then, like I said, I'm Daniell. I'm gonna be joined today by Vince. I'm gonna be passing the slides over to him in just a little bit. But I just want to let you know that Vince is a telecommunications lawyer who has been working on this actual issue, and I've been working with him and his partner, Mike Bradley, and I really have enjoyed working with them on this. So I'm really, thankful that he's been able to join us today. And then I'm going to just give you a quick run through of what we're going to talk about. I'm always working at not reading things on the screen directly to you, so I am not going to read these items, but this is the outline we're going to run through. So first thing is, I'm going to be using some captioning terms. I wanted to define those real quick and put them together into an equation. So the first term is encoder. And when we talk about an encoder, most of the time when we say that word, what we're talking about is a piece of hardware that in real time adds the captions into the video stream. So there are also ways to add captions in post-production just using software. You can maybe insert captions using Premiere, something that isn't live, or other tools you can insert your captions with once they're generated. But in this case, we're talking about live captioning, and we're talking about a piece of hardware that goes into your rack, and that's the encoder. And there's a lot of different models. I'm just going to use a generic placeholder in my diagram that doesn't refer to any one particular manufacturer. Same thing with the engine. In this case, when we talk about engine, could be a professional human service, the traditional way of doing captioning, the highest quality way to do this. Could also be artificial intelligence on a local PC or in the cloud. By engine, we're just talking about the thing that hears the audio and generates the text. And also in the diagrams, I'm going to use a generic placeholder that could be any one of a bunch of different engine types. Because I'm trying to give you a simplified equation, a simplified diagram, make it easy to understand, even though there's lots of potential variables. And then, of course, when we talk about closed captioning, we're talking about where the words can be turned on or off by the viewer at home with the remote, or if they're on a live stream, there's usually like a little CC button. Sometimes you'll see it where it's burned into the video. It's there no matter what. You couldn't turn it off as a viewer. And that phrase is called open captioning. It's very similar. We won't go into the details on that. It's not that it's not a possible way of doing it. It's just most folks want to do it in a way where it's user selectable, and that's the closed captioning. So my little equation here, if you're going to just remember one basic thing from this, it's the encoder plus the engine equals closed captioning. You need to have the hardware that inserts it. You need to have the thing that's turning the speech into text. Okay, I'm going to turn it over now to Vince. Vince, can you take over the screen from your end?
I think so here. Here we go. All right. All right. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Tightrope, for having me on this. As I said, my name is Vince Rotty. I'm an associate attorney at Bradley Law, LLC. You can see my contact information there on screen. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions beyond this presentation, or if you would like a copy of my slides or anything like that. I'm happy to help any way I can. So as far as legal obligations, we're going to go through a couple things here. There are three primary sources of federal law that impose closed captioning requirements. And then at the very end, I'm going to go over just kind of a real quick best practices for local governments. So the first requirement that you have, or the first source of law that imposes a requirement on you, is the Rehabilitation Act. However, this is really not something that applies to most local governments. This is specifically Section 508 is often stated as imposing, kind of this be-all, end-all requirement for you to provide closed captioning, and frankly, that's just not true for most of you. The Rehabilitation Act is generally only applicable to federal agencies and those cities receiving federal aid, and the cities that are using that federal aid to produce video programming. The Federal Cable Act also imposes some requirements to provide closed captioning. And unlike the ADA, the Federal Cable Act applies to both content producers and distributors. However, there are two major exemptions to the Cable Act's closed captioning requirements. The first is that closed captioning is not required if the captioning expense would exceed 2% of gross revenues. The other exception, it's a fairly major one, is that any channel producing less than $3 million annually is exempt from these same requirements, and that's on a per channel basis. So if you're a PEG operator that has 3 channels and receives $7 million a year in franchise fees, which good for you, you do not have a requirement to provide closed captioning under the Federal Cable Act. As far as we're aware, from our end, there are essentially no PEG channels that produce a revenue of over $3 million a year, making just about everybody on this call exempt from the Cable Act's closed captioning requirements. Following, most of you also do web streaming, and the Cable Act also addresses that, and specifically through an amendment known as the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act. That act required the FCC to create closed captioning rules for web streaming, and the FCC generally just stated, if you're required to provide closed captioning for TV, you're also required to provide closed captioning for web streaming. Therefore, when we look back at these exemptions that apply to just about everybody is also then exempt from applying closed captioning for web streaming. One of the other things the FCC did in their most recent report and orders on closed captioning is that they require you to self-report either compliance with the FCC's closed captioning rules or self-reporting that you're exempt. This report and order went into effect in 2016. It's now 2019, and we have yet to see this kind of online form or any sort of paper format even for this reporting to take place. So as far as we know, this is essentially an empty requirement right now. Moving to the big one, and this is where your closed captioning requirements are really going to come from, the Americans with Disability Act. A common question we get is, does the ADA apply to PEG? And the DOJ has expressly and affirmatively said, yes, it does. And this includes PEG programming produced by outside entities such as nonprofit corporations, maybe set up by a local franchising authority to manage PEG operations. So what does the ADA require? It requires you to provide effective communication. Whatever you think this term means, it probably means something else. This is a legal standard that will differ between jurisdictions. However, this duty is limited to content producers. not distributors. The general rule is that if you make it, you caption it. I think that's a kind of an easy way to think about it. You don't necessarily have to provide closed captioning. You just have to provide effective communication. But the DOJ has said, and this is the only tool that they've said, they're the only auxiliary aid and service that the DOJ has said provides effective communication is closed captioning. We have to remember the types of disabilities we're addressing when providing effective communication. I mean, if you have a blind person that says, hey, I want descriptive audio put in, saying, the car turned left at the stoplight, something like that. Clearly, closed captioning isn't going to provide any accessibility to that type of person. As with all good laws, there is an exemption to the ADA requirement to provide effective communication. And that is if providing effective communication, i.e. closed captioning, for this presentation, would cause an undue financial and administrative burden. Many PEG operators, local franchising authorities, towns, cities, counties, villages have limited financial and administrative resources. If you're lucky, you get your PEG fees and your franchise fees, and many of you I know don't even get that. So it shouldn't be overly difficult to show that providing closed captioning would cause you an undue financial or administrative burden. But this is something you still need to study. We would suggest, putting together a report, something like that, so that you can show, your leaders, and in the event you're ever sued, you can show opposing counsel what you've done. In the alternative, where you're not required then, or where providing maybe closed captioning would cause an undue and financial administrative burden, you are nevertheless required to provide accessibility to the maximum extent possible. This means that you need to provide accessibility to the extent your resources will allow. This might mean providing open captioning. It might mean using a captioning tool that is, using an AI captioning tool that is not corrected or only corrected to 80% or 60%. Figuring this part out is probably the most resource intensive part of your ADA analysis. So what should you do moving forward from a legal perspective? We always, and Daniel and I have had success doing this in the past, is consider getting a group of LFAs together to reduce your costs. These are expensive studies, and they're very time intensive. The first thing you always need to do is identify your legal standards. We've talked about some of the federal ones, or the primary federal standards. There are also state ones. For instance, in Minnesota here, and I know we have a couple Minnesota people on the call, we have the Minnesota Human Rights Act that does come into play for us. The next thing we suggest doing is identifying closed captioning services, equipment, and their costs, and then identify your available resources. These are kind of the two things you need to figure out to determine whether or not any of those services and equipment would cause an undue burden. After determining that, we always recommend developing a compliance plan. The ADA doesn't require this, and the FCC's rules don't require this, but having an ADA compliance plan is just critical. That way, if you're not providing effective communication at the time you receive a lawsuit, you can more easily just show, hey, we're working towards that, and that's really what the ADA wants you to do. The ADA isn't trying to make anybody go broke or put anybody out of business. The ADA wants you to just provide accessibility, or try to provide accessibility to the extent that you can. A common question we get is, is doing nothing better than doing something? And frankly, it almost never is under current ADA case law. One last thing to kind of remember is that this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. We expect each jurisdiction to have a different outcome based on different programming volumes and types. You all have different sizes and budgets. You have different budgeting priorities. You have different, different types of equipment and different staff. Frankly, I mean, we work with LFAs that have almost no administrative staff, or we work with LFAs that are very government meeting heavy, and other LFAs that are very sports programming heavy. It's just important to remember what your resources are. So kind of in conclusion for the legal part here, the ADA requires you to do something. At the very least, you have to study what your resources are and what your options for providing effective communication are. And then if the FCC at some point ever develops their online reporting, we need to start self-reporting to the FCC. So I think that'll do it for me, and I will kick this back to you, Daniel.
So thank you very much, Vince. As Vince said, the goal is to provide effective communication to everyone using the resources that are available. And doing this involves determining the total amount of resources, determining the total amount of content responsibility that you're going to be addressing as you gather various proposals. And then you're going to want to gather the cost of multiple options so that you can see what it costs to deal with the amount of content you have in more than one different way. Make sure that you're seeing the whole range. And you're going to weigh the costs that you put together against the resources that are available to your local government or NPO or joint powers authority or school district, whatever your group is that's addressing this. As I have in CAPS here, it's best to then consult with your telecommunications attorney or your city attorney or your school attorney. You know, this is stuff that you want to go through it with all the proper protection of having stuff documented and making sure that you're getting prepared for the possibility of someone filing any sort of complaint, even if it's not about your channel. If they're filing an accessibility complaint against something with your physical facilities in the city or bathrooms or the website or lots of different things, you're going to want to have documented your process here and done it with your local legal help. And then, of course, working with them, you're going to create an official report which documents the cost of those options and which ones you're going to consider. You're going to be able to tell as you put this together that the effective communication solution is obvious, or that you're going to find a different effective communication solution if you cannot afford some of your options that are there. And then if you're going to have any sort of report that's going to say that you're determining that a certain form of effective communication is a burden administratively or financially or both, it does say in the description of the language there that you need to have that signed off by a department head or higher. So this is the kind of thing that does need to be addressed by a certain level of official if you're operating as a local government and not a nonprofit. This is just my opinion, and again, I'm just throwing this out there, but I think if you're looking at what you're going to do and you're only going to do some of the content you're producing, you should start with your meetings first. Start with providing the most access to local democracy. If you can do content right off the bat beyond meetings in that first phase, great. But look at what's achievable as you're breaking things into phases. You don't necessarily have to do everything in the first initial attempt on your channel if what you're doing is actually developing a plan and looking at rolling out meeting content and other civic content, and then content that produced by others or content that comes in without captions. Your responsibility is on your own content, but you can kind of develop a plan around how you're going to do your content and if you're going to cover other content. And then the last thing I like to put here is that what you put together as a plan serves as a shield for you. It gives you something that you can offer as a defense that you are working on this. This is something you're addressing. It's better to have something than have nothing. And making a plan is definitely having something. In fact, just coming to this webinar is something. We were talking about this yesterday, how even just having something that says you've gone to a webinar, you're starting to make a plan, you're going through this, is better than if somebody asks you and you have no documentation that you're doing anything on this. So I ended up making a certificate. I'll share at the end of this. If anybody would like a certificate of participation that says that they have participated and they are taking that first step, I'm happy to insert their name into it and send it to them. Now moving on to the next section. This is just something I like to quickly address. Why are we actually asking this question now, dealing with this now? Why is it after decades of broadcasting and people not necessarily having this be their concern, this is now their concern? And in my view, again, I'm not the lawyer here, but I think part of it is legal, part of it are lawsuits that cities have faced and school districts have faced and universities have faced, and that this has changed the legal situation a bit. But also I think it's cultural. I think the fact that people are seeing captions on Hulu, Netflix, Amazon Prime that are professionally captioned, and they're also getting captions on all the YouTube content that's automatically captioned. Adding that to the broadcast captions, I think people are now expecting, just on a gut level, that all video that they tune into is going to have captions in a way that just a couple years ago, I think people did not expect, just instinctually, that if they turned on a video source, they would see some captions there. So I think that's why we're dealing with this now. I would love other people's thoughts. If anybody has other thoughts. Again, part of it is legal. There's a county in Wisconsin that shut down its channel so that it wouldn't have to further address this. I think that's put a lot of folks paying attention. And there's been other places that have had to implement solutions or even settle lawsuits. So it is a legal thing, but I think it is also cultural. Okay, these are 9 questions that I put together that I think are helpful if you could ask yourself or ask your teammates or there's other people you're working with as you start to prepare to make your plan. Again, I think the most important thing for most folks, seeing that they're probably not already captioning or only captioning a little bit, is to develop a plan that they're going to try to implement. And as they're starting to put together that plan, they should ask themselves a few questions. So here they are, not in a particular order. Again, I'll make these available, so if you don't write them all down as we're going, that's fine. I can send you this afterwards. But first thing is, ask yourself, what content do you want to deal with in the first phase? Obviously, you could calculate, and you should calculate what the cost should be if you did every piece of content produced by your organization. But if you're going to be looking at what you can actually accomplish in 2019 or in 2020, and you're going to break things into phase 1, 2, 3 for the implementation, determine what's going to be that first phase. Also, take a good look at your current playback system. Figure out which parts are definitely closed captions compatible, which parts are likely incompatible. What you'll possibly find, though everybody's setup is a little bit different, but what you'll possibly find is that your core playback system, your Tightrope cablecast, might be totally software-wise closed captions compatible. If it's been updated to the latest version of the software, you might need to get updated to the latest version to get all the features. But you might have some small elements of your playback workflow, like mini converters that go from HD to SD or SD to HD, and that they strip captions. The lowest cost mini converters that I see almost every time I go out looking in playback racks, I won't name the ones, but they're the most widely deployed. Those low cost mini converters strip the captioning, whereas the higher quality professional converters from the same company will carry through the captioning. So you might have a couple converters you have to upgrade, a couple $100, $1,000, something like that. You might end up spending, changing out that stuff. It's just good to figure out that. Looking at that will help you see if there's anything else about your live streaming or anything else in your AirPath that you might have to take into account. Next thing, just on that same thought process of looking at your playback rack and seeing what else in your rack might have to be upgraded, is look at if you have everything in place to monitor the captions. Some places just have a TV that they watch the return feed on and they can turn the captions on with the remote. That's great. But if you could, it'd be great to have it go through a multi-viewer where you can see the captions as they're generated and see them as they're coming back from the cable company or the telco a couple seconds later. That'll let you very clearly see if there's an issue, if the issue is with the cable company or the telco's delivery, or if it's on your end. You can see, hey, we're sending them out. Why are they not coming back anymore? Or, oh, they're not going out either. Oh, yes, we unplugged the hardware accidentally when we were in the back of the rack. Something like that. So in a best case, you have a compatible multi-viewer. It's not absolutely required, but it just makes it better for paying attention. And then on that same thread again of paying attention, who in your organization would you want to make the point person for captioning? I've got here a couple different, areas of an organization. It might be based on who the person is, who's best suited for it, personality-wise, attention to detail, or the person who best knows your playback. It could be a large organization and you want to put it under the budget of the IT department, or you want to put it in the budget of the cable channel, and the decision's made that way. But it's good to start thinking through who's going to be in charge, because their needs kind of dictate workflow that's most appropriate, at least in a lot of situations. Next question, how many hours should you have captioned if you did everything the way you should have last year? I'm not bringing this up to make anybody feel bad that they didn't do captioning in the past or that they have all these hours, but it's a good way to just look at last year's numbers to get a good sense of what this year or next year's numbers could look like. You might have already a sense that it might go up or down 5 or 10%, but you just need to get a range so that you can start getting quotes. And then in addition to the live hours, you can do a similar tally of how many hours of produced content that wasn't live. Some systems and solutions, price that the same. Some do it at different prices. So it's good to just get those numbers both, so as you start figuring out totals. Another detail here, and this kind of falls under the whose responsibility in the organization, custom dictionaries can make all of the automated solutions more accurate. Also with the human professional solutions, it gives the people who are captioning, a list of names that they will be able to preload and they're like, oh, that's who that console person is, and they're not just doing phonetics. So whichever type of solution you go, human, professional, or automated, putting together a custom dictionary can be a big benefit. It's not a terrible idea to think through which department or which person, or is that something you would hire out? And then, if you are going human, you're going to have more accurate. They will actually let you download the near complete. It might not be corrected, but it was very accurate on the time it was generated. If you're going AI, it'll be a little less accurate, sometimes more than a little less accurate. Just depends on a lot of factors. If you're going to do AI, you might choose to correct it and have someone spend the time fixing. You might choose to not correct it. That's a thing to talk about, because that's another thing to either budget for or to determine when you're comparing. And then, of course, the scale of correcting. Just think about if someone is going to do it, how many total meetings, how many hours. If you're going to have a staff person going through, it might be okay for them to do one. It might be accomplishable, might be not accomplishable to have them do dozens of meetings. And then, of course, the money question. And part of the question is who might pay for it in terms of you get underwriting, might you get sponsorship or grant money, but also like which funds might you be paying for this out of? Some operations have a lot of capital funds and very limited operating funds. Some operations are more comfortable with operating funds than those ones I just talked about. If you figure out where you want to pay for it, that's a good thing to take into account, because there's different business models for all the different solutions. And it does play a factor often in people's decision. And then that's the last thing to really talk about is your decision-making process. Working with folks on their playback systems and transmission and different technology over the years, feels like there's often a lot of factors that people take into account as they're making the decision, but maybe that they don't always discuss those factors of like, all right, we're definitely making this decision based on upfront price, or we're definitely making this decision based on which one has the best user interface. And in a lot of ways, you might be able to just look at all the things and go by a gut feeling. But in this case, I think it is helpful to decide, what do we usually base things off of? Is it based on which one we like the feel of more, the cost of more, the accuracy or quality of more? Or in this case, which one do we want to make our decisions around, or at least go into the decision-making process aware that those are our factors that we usually prioritize or might. And I have on here both costs for short-term and long-term. Sometimes organizations are much more comfortable with the upfront cost, but they really are not comfortable ongoing. Other places are okay kind of spreading it out. So just, knowing those things up front helps. Okay, this is my attempt to make a generic diagram so that it's not tied to one particular encoder or one particular engine type. It's a little bit redundant because the side thing on the right is more of a recap just put together in a rack. But it's basically just showing that the video goes from the original video source into an encoder. That SDI video goes into the encoder talks with the engine, sends the audio, gets the text. So that's why I have those little arrows there between those two boxes. And the encoder inserts the text into the video and sends that video back out, where it goes into your cablecast server to be recorded, goes into the broadcast switch to get routed on air, to go to your live stream encoder. All the places that you need the video with captions, it goes after it's come out of the encoder, and at the same time that it's going into the server to be recorded. You record it so that if you're playing back the meeting 6 more times, you don't have to caption it on every playback. You also record it so that you can generate caption files for video on demand and other purposes. And then over here in the middle, you'll see there's different types of closed caption engines. And I tried to break these up to make these a little clear. The professional human captioning there at the top, that's your most traditional, your highest quality. It is the most expensive because you are paying a trained professional, but they have human logic. They're not going to do things that a computerized system does. There are some regards in which a computerized system is technically more accurate because it catches every nuance, but I don't think we're at a stage yet where anybody could say, oh yes, the AI is definitely more accurate. It's a different kind of accuracy. But the AI is getting better. A lot of folks want to weigh those solutions. They are also valid. So I have them kind of ranked here by what is most traditional, what people are kind of choosing. More people seem to want to have a server that's local that they bought out, I think because it matches their pricing model of wanting to spend, or their business model of wanting to spend on capital. Similarly, you can get a local server that lives locally, but you're actually paying for it monthly or annually and more of a lease term. That does seem to be harder for a lot of cities and nonprofits and organizations, even if the price balances out in a way where sometimes it's less expensive. It just seems to be a difference in how it's purchased that makes it more of an issue. And then the one on the bottom there, and again, this is a model that's becoming more and more common, where the artificial intelligence doesn't live on a local server, it lives in the cloud using the internet connection. You're sending audio over IP and getting text back in real time. So all of those are options. Some places combine more than one. They might have a professional human for their core meetings, and then they might, incorporate AI for other content. And we'll find out as time goes on if people will have questions. We'll go into details if anybody here is currently using any AI or anybody here is using humans. But I'm happy to give you more information on all those at a later time. All right. Last thing, I mentioned that certificate of participation. If anybody would like something like this just to show that they are in the process, happy to generate this for you. Just contact me after and I will generate that and send it to you. Final thing, words of encouragement. This is a lot. I know I've just run through a lot. I know there's a lot of threat if you don't address it at all. And even if you are addressing it, you can always be sued for anything. You're just basically making a good case that you have addressed things and you are doing your best and you're providing effective communication. But don't get overwhelmed. You can do this. You can provide captioning. The technology has gotten a lot easier. The costs have come down. Even doing it with professional humans is less expensive than it used to be. You can do this. And you've already started doing this by coming to this webinar, by looking at this technology. You're taking the first steps, and the next steps are just as attainable as signing up for this webinar. It's not an unachievable goal. So anyway, if you have any other needs, I'm going to leave this up. Reach out to me. I'm happy to provide you, more personalized words of encouragement, more personalized help. Been doing this and really enjoying it, and happy to work with more cities. So thank you very much.
I know we've run a little bit over, but a lot of you are still hanging on till the very end. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Daniell Krawczyk from Municipal Captioning, Vince Rotty from Bradley Law, Minnesota. We'll let you all go and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much.